In this video, we're going to cover who can add items to the agenda. This is a question that comes up all the time, and it's one of the most commonly misunderstood aspects of parliamentary law. Before we get into the agenda, it's important that we understand the distinction between an order of business and an agenda. If you've adopted Robert's Rules of Order as your parliamentary authority, then you already have an order of business. It is called the Standard Order of Business, and it can be found in Section 41, Paragraph 5 of Robert's Rules of Order. If your regular meetings are separated by no more than a quarterly time interval, then this Standard Order of Business applies. And this Standard Order of Business is sufficient for most organizations because it provides a logical place in the meeting for every item of business that is likely to come up. There are 6 headings in the Standard Order of Business. It starts with the reading and approval of the minutes. Next is reports of officers, boards, and standing committees. Then we have reports of special committees. Then special orders. After that, we have unfinished business and general orders. And finally, we have new business. This is why I often say that most meetings don't need an agenda at all, because there's already a space for each class of business in the Standard Order of Business. But in this video, we are talking about meetings where an agenda is being used, and more specifically, how items are placed on that agenda. One of the most common misconceptions is that the president controls the agenda for the meeting, or that the board controls the agenda for the general membership meeting. First, it must be understood that a meeting has no agenda unless one is adopted inside the session to which it applies. This means that any agenda that is sent to members in advance of a session is just a draft agenda or proposed agenda. And it is not binding on the session in any way unless it is adopted by the assembly in its meeting. Robert's Rules of Order makes this clear by saying, unless a pre-circulated agenda is formally adopted at the session to which it applies, it is not binding as to detail or order of consideration. Now, it's very important to understand that it must be adopted at the session to which it applies. This aligns with the principle that the assembly itself is in charge of its own meeting. So, how is an agenda adopted? Well, it's usually adopted at the beginning of the meeting, usually after any opening ceremonies. Let's take a look at the process. The chair says the first item of business is the adoption of the agenda. The proposed agenda has been distributed, and the question is now on its adoption. Is there any debate or amendment on the agenda? Now, in this particular version, we are assuming that the agenda has been provided to the members in some way, either being mailed or emailed days before the meeting, or at least being passed out in the meeting before it is called to order. Anyway, we are assuming that the members have had the chance to review the agenda. It's always a good idea to provide the proposed agenda in advance, but if the agenda has not been distributed, the chair would need to read the agenda or have the secretary read it, or at least have it displayed on a screen or passed out to the members. It's important for members to understand their rights in this regard. Robert's Rules of Order states, when any paper is laid before the assembly for action, it is a right of every member that it be read once, and if there is any debate or amendment, that it be read again before members are asked to vote on it. This simply provides a reasonable opportunity for members to understand what it is they're being asked to decide. Normally this isn't necessary because the agenda is distributed to members and the reading is skipped. Once the chair has placed the agenda before the assembly for adoption, any member may offer an amendment to the agenda. A member does this by obtaining the floor and saying, I move to amend the agenda by. The member would then explain the proposed amendment. For example, let's say the proposed agenda looks like this. And let's say a member wanted item number 6 to come up earlier in the meeting, the motion to rescind the rule about overnight parking, so that the agenda would look like this. To propose this change, a member would obtain the floor and say, I move to amend the agenda by relocating item number 6, rescind rule about overnight parking, to right after the reports of officers. This motion to amend the agenda requires a second, and it is debatable. So if it receives a second, the chair places it before the assembly by saying, it is moved and seconded to amend the agenda by striking out rescind rule about overnight parking from number 6 and to insert it as the new number 3, just below the reports of officers. Is there any debate? Members can then debate the amendment to the agenda, but keep in mind that they are only debating whether or not it will be relocated on the agenda. They are not debating whether or not to rescind the rule about overnight parking. Such debate would not be in order at this time. After any debate, the amendment would be put to a vote by the chair saying, "The question is on striking out rescind the rule about overnight parking from number 6 and to insert it as the new number 3 just below the reports of officers." Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The amendment requires a majority vote, and if it is adopted, the proposed agenda is changed to reflect the amendment. If the amendment is lost, the proposed agenda is not changed. While the agenda is being considered, a member may also move to amend the agenda by inserting or adding a new item of business. For example, let's say a member wanted to add a motion to award lifetime membership to someone. The member would need to decide where to insert it in the agenda, and for our purposes here, we'll just settle for adding it to the bottom of the list, right before adjournment, so that it would become the new number 7. So, to propose this amendment, the member would obtain the floor and say, "I move to amend the agenda by inserting 7, award lifetime membership to Jane Addams," after number 6. This requires a second, and it is debatable. After any debate, the amendment is put to a vote, and if it is adopted, the new item is inserted in the agenda. If the amendment is lost, the item is not inserted. So let's look at a question now. Who can amend the proposed agenda while it is being considered? The President, any member, the Assembly, or all of the above? Pause the video if you'd like more time. The correct answer is the Assembly. Only the Assembly can amend the agenda while it is being considered. Members can propose amendments, but it requires a majority vote of the Assembly to adopt those amendments. Now, if the President or Secretary drafts a proposed agenda in advance of the meeting, it's important to understand that there is nothing official or binding about that proposed agenda. Once it is placed before the Assembly for consideration, it no longer belongs to whoever drafted it. At that point, it belongs to the Assembly, and the Assembly is free to amend it. It is also important to keep in mind, though, that even after amendment by the Assembly, the agenda is not binding until it is officially adopted. So that brings us to our next question. Who adopts the agenda? The President, the Secretary, the Assembly, or all of the above? Pause the video if you'd like more time. The correct answer is, once again, the Assembly. So we're seeing the power that the Assembly has over its meeting. It controls everything. No one, not the President, not the CEO, not the Executive Director, not the organization's parliamentarian or legal counsel, can usurp the Assembly's authority to control its own meeting and adopt its own agenda. Now, when an agenda is adopted, it is normally done by unanimous consent. This means that when there are no further amendments or debate, that is, when the Assembly has the agenda in the exact form that it prefers, the presiding officer simply says, "If there is no objection, the agenda shall be adopted." If no member objects, the chair then declares the agenda adopted, and this is the most common way that agendas are adopted. With this process, a vote isn't taken unless a member objects, in which case the chair would put it to a formal vote. Now, the actual vote requirement to adopt the agenda varies depending on the details of the particular organization and the nature of the agenda itself. Robert's Rules of Order has this to say on the matter. At a session that already has an order of business, an agenda can be adopted by a majority vote only if it does not create any special orders and does not conflict with the existing order of business. Otherwise, a 2/3 vote is required. Now let's look at another important question that is a bit trickier than the last two. Who can amend the agenda after it is adopted? This means the Assembly has already adopted the agenda just the way it wants it to be. And maybe they're already 30 minutes into the meeting and halfway through the agenda. At this point, who can amend the agenda? The President, the Secretary, the Assembly, or no one? Pause the video if you'd like more time. The correct answer is still the Assembly. That's right, the Assembly can still amend the agenda after it has been adopted. Robert's Rules of Order has this to say on the subject. After an agenda has been adopted by the Assembly, no change can be made in it except by a 2/3 vote, a vote of a majority of the entire membership, or unanimous consent. So it does take more than a majority vote, but the agenda can still be amended after it's adopted. showing once again the power that the Assembly retains over its own meeting. The reason the topic of adding items to an agenda is such a frequently asked question is that many members find themselves in a position where they've been told that the president or an executive board has set the agenda for the meeting, and that no business is in order unless it appears on that agenda. Both of these points are inaccurate. First, only the Assembly itself sets its agenda, which it can amend at any time. Second, the adoption of an agenda determines the order in which, and sometimes the times at which, certain items of business or classes of business will be handled. But there is no rule that business must be specifically listed on an agenda to be introduced in a meeting. Adopting an agenda that prescribes a sequence for certain items of business does not prevent the consideration of additional items of business once those certain items on the agenda have been dealt with. Let's say the Assembly adopted an agenda to consider 6 resolutions in a specific order. Let's say resolutions A through F. After this agenda is adopted, of course, the Assembly will move through each item of business listed on the agenda. The Assembly will first take up item number 1, and when it's disposed of, the Assembly moves on to item number 2, and so on. Now, it is possible that when a particular item on the agenda is reached, it won't be taken up at all. Perhaps action taken earlier in the meeting will render this particular item of business no longer applicable, relevant, or desirable. Just because it has been placed on the agenda doesn't mean it must come before the Assembly. If no member actually wishes to make the motion at the time it is reached, then the chair simply moves to the next item on the agenda. Now, at any point while items remain on this agenda, it would not be in order for a member to introduce a resolution that's not on the agenda, since the Assembly, by adopting the agenda, has decided the specific resolutions that shall be considered in a specific order, and there's no place on the agenda for that resolution. However, once the items of business on the agenda have been handled, a new resolution may be introduced, since there are no longer any items on the agenda to prevent its introduction. On the other hand, if an agenda is adopted with an adjournment listed at the end, which is quite common, then once all the other items on the agenda have been handled, it would not be in order to introduce a new item of business, since by adopting the agenda, the Assembly has set adjournment as the order of the day that follows item number 6, to use our example here. In this situation, for new business to be introduced, the Assembly would have to either amend the agenda or set aside the orders of the day. To prevent this situation, it is often desirable for an agenda to contain the heading of New Business, which is best placed at the end, right before adjournment. This is a wonderful heading to have on the agenda because its purpose is to provide a place in the meeting for the introduction of new business. With this heading on the agenda, there's no need for members to amend the agenda to list their desired items of business, since those items of business will be in order under new business. Now, in cases where it's intentionally left off an agenda, this is primarily because whoever is drafting the agenda believes that omitting new business will prevent members from bringing forth motions. This strategy, of course, relies on members not knowing they can amend the agenda to insert the heading of new business. And I am, of course, a proponent of members clearly understanding their rights and their power in a meeting. So don't be afraid to offer an amendment to the proposed agenda when it's being considered, or even after it's adopted. Now, in conclusion, who can add items to the agenda? The Assembly. That is, the body of members who assemble in a meeting. That covers who can add items to the agenda.